As Ed said, this is a bittersweet moment. Dr. Joe Chuman has been the leader of our community for 47 years. He has challenged us to be participants in making the world a better place, not in silos, but within community. And I know that I am a better person because of ethical culture and Joe. This is Joe's last First Sunday address to us as he prepares to retire at the end of this month. He will be speaking today about life and work. It is with great feeling that I now give you Joe.
Well, thank you so very much, Susan, and welcome to all of you on this beautiful fall day. I want to extend my condolences also to Rob on the passing of his father. We've spoken about it through the weeks and the previous months, and I also want to congratulate Mary and Wes. That is great news about Elena. Elena grew up in our Sunday school, and if I got it right, it was a long time ago that she was actually responsible for bringing her parents into the society. So 3 cheers for Elena. I'm very happy for her, and if I get her address, I'll speak to her directly, communicate. I'm really very, very pleased. And I want to thank Len and Perry also for working behind the scenes so diligently to be able to bring us quality music. We had decided that we would not have music unless we could deploy it with quality, and they worked on this problem and resolved it. We are problem-solving creatures, and the society is particularly adept at solving problems. So it's really great. So now we have quality music. Okay. Let's get on the way. I'm looking forward to talking to you this morning. The title of my address, Life and Work. I believe that the lives we live are fashioned in distinctive ways as unique combinations of the conditions that fate and fortune present us with and what we choose and are able to create out of those conditions. One doesn't have to have much imagination, I think, to conclude that if we were born in a different place and a different time, and in different circumstances, our lives would be very much different. Our lives are played out within the opportunities that confront us, and the lives of most people partake of both triumphs and defeat, joys and tragedies. As I grow older, I find that I am moved to take a wider perspective on life. Moved by humility, I've been increasingly aware that much of what I have been able to become has been a result of the fortuitous circumstances into which I was born. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically brings home, like nothing else, the very thick line separating the privileged from the unprivileged. I look with tremendous discomfort and perhaps even a little bit of guilt at the tens of millions of my fellow Americans who, out of a job, must be experiencing nearly unbearable anxiety, not knowing how they will pay their rent at the end of the month, our ongoing crushing humiliation of needing to wait on long food lines to receive a handout in order to ensure that their children not go hungry. I, by contrast, live in a warm home with a roof over my head, with more food than I need, and sufficient money squirreled away that I can feel reasonably secure about my future. My point is that I am here and they are there. Not because I have been more ambitious or am more virtuous or smarter than they are, but I have achieved in life what I've primarily been able to because of the good fortune to have been born into socioeconomic conditions that I myself did nothing to create. If I am fair to the facts, I must humbly conclude that I am where I am in life primarily because of luck. There, but for fortune go I, said Phil Oakes 50 years ago so aptly. When I compare myself to the masses of humanity, I conclude that I have been most fortunate. I have lived a privileged life, but I should say one that has not been uniformly privileged. My life in great measure has also been shaped by tragedy and trauma, not of my own making, and has required a great deal of personal struggle in the pursuit of happiness, which I conclude remains somewhat elusive, and perhaps this is true for most of us. One of the truly great triumphs of my life is that I have found extraordinary fulfillment in my work. And the mainstay of my work, as you know, has been as the professional leader of this ethical society for the past 46 years. I will devote the major portion of my address this morning to sharing with you how I have experienced my work and how it has been enriching beyond words. But First, I want to explain the wider circumstances that extend across several generations and that have provided the endowed framework which has enabled me to bring forth what is in me to shape my life. Perhaps many people believe that they create their own lives by virtue of their own talents, their drive, their intelligence, and by the power of their will. Our ego, I think, seduces us to believe this, but I think at best this is only partly true. Who we become, again, I assert, is primarily a product of what, speaking for myself, what I'm referring to as fate and fortune. Those conditions and circumstances that we were born into and which we played no role in creating. I was the legatee of very fortunate circumstances. I am, in fact, a product of the American dream when that dynamic arguably reached its high watermark. There is no more dramatic illustration of this than the fact that my father was born into abject poverty into a Jewish shtetl, that is a hamlet or a village in the Ukraine, had absolutely no formal education except for 3 years of Hebrew training, only aimed at living a devout life. My father, as a child, suffered from typhoid fever and witnessed and experienced the violence and terror of Tsarist-induced pogroms. After migrating to the New World, first to Cuba and then the United States, my father became a successful middle-class businessman. He was a haberdasher. He began life in extreme poverty with no formal education. And within nearly a generation, his older son was able to attain 3 graduate degrees from an Ivy League university. The contrast in just a generation, historically, in a blink of an eye, I think is quite stark and rather extraordinary. On my mother's side, I need to trace the arc of upward mobility back 2 generations. My maternal grandparents were born in the 1870s, also in a small Jewish hamlet, this time in eastern Poland. They came to New York around 1900 and settled first on the Lower East Side. They had 7 children, of which my mother was the youngest. My grandfather was a tailor who worked his entire life in sweatshops, and like his wife, my grandma, never learned English, though they lived in this country for more than 60 years. They were Yiddish speaking all their lives. It may be apocryphal, but I was told that my grandfather had said to his children, quote, I don't care whether you are ever rich or not, but I want you all to be educated. And so they became. His oldest son became a college professor of Latin and Greek and authored some of the earliest texts in vocabulary building. 3 others went to college. All but one led very successful professional lives. At a time when it was still uncommon, my mother was a college graduate, Hunter class of 1933. Today, I teach at Hunter in part out of reverence for my mother's blessed memory. My point again is that my cherishing education and the life of the mind, which I do in great measure, were set in motion by a reality larger and prior to myself. It involved a framework of values I inherited from my ancestry and my family. In other words, it was in great measure a gift. I was also fortunate to have been born after the Second World War, at a time when the middle class was probably never stronger, and the arc of upward mobility for the immigrant generation was a powerful dynamic which in great measure pulled my family along in its wake. I was privileged because I was born and spent my early childhood at a time when the economy was at my back, and there was never a doubt that I would ever have to find employment out of austerity or dire need. Rather, I came of age at a time when I had the good fortune to be able to choose my career, rather than being wedged into it out of economic necessity. I think that was quite a luxury, which I contend only a minority of people have been able to enjoy. I recall my childhood as a very happy one, primarily because I was the object of my mother's embracing love. It was a time when children were still free to roam the neighborhoods at will. And though my mother was not a permissivist, she did allow me to ride the subways into Manhattan from our neighborhood in Queens when I was but 11 years old. Going into Manhattan alone or with a friend, venturing into the Emerald City. Sometimes I would travel with a pal up to the Bronx, and we would take in a game at Yankee Stadium. It was a different and I think more carefree time. I recall my mom saying to me, and this is rather startling, before my jaunts into the city, that if I ever got lost or needed assistance, that I should approach a stranger and ask them for help. Today, I think she would probably be accused of child abuse, okay? But back then, it was assumed that the larger world was essentially a friendly and not a threatening place, and every adult had responsibility for everyone else's child. I think that dynamic has basically disappeared, unfortunately, from our culture, okay? I think children today live in a more frightening and less carefree world. Between the freedom to explore, the joy of roaming the neighborhood with friends, the happiness of watching television, going to museums, and Saturdays at the movies, but most of all, because I lived in the warmth and security of my mother's love, I considered myself very happy. That radically changed in September 1960. My mother suffered from a cerebral hemorrhage, was taken away to the hospital, and died some 10 days later, my never having seen her again. My beloved mother died prematurely at the age of 47 when I was just 12 years old. My mother's untimely and essentially sudden death left me and my younger brother in the hands of my father. My father was much older, had never really assimilated to American life and culture, and had absolutely no idea as to how to manage a household or be a parent. I mean, roles in marriages, of course, then were very, very gendered. He was completely lost. Shortly after my mother's death, my father began to deteriorate physically, emotionally, and mentally. And as he did so, he became a tyrant and extremely abusive, but I should say not physically. My life became very painful as I experienced loneliness, depression, and there was not an iota of love coming from anyone in my life. The agony of depression is that you feel that you are at the bottom of a dark pit that you can't crawl out of. One's thoughts become involuted. They turn inwards so that you cannot think your way out of it either. Depression is one of life's ravaging and painful nightmares. The contrast between life with my mom and living on the front lines of my father's abuse was very stark and was really a long drawn out trauma. I experienced my father's progressive deterioration over 9 years in a condition of helplessness. My father, in fact, was institutionalized for the last 3 years of his life, creating the very unusual situation of 2 children living by themselves alone in an apartment without any parental supervision. My brother and I were not legally, but functionally, we were orphans. It was those dire circumstances that attracted me, in fact, to humanism when I was entering college at 16. As I had mentioned, in fact, in a previous address last year, I discovered humanism through reading the work, and voraciously so, of the social psychologist Erich Fromm. My unhappiness in this period led me to the conclusion that if I was going to emotionally survive, that I needed to take responsibility for building my own life, so to speak. Emotional survival and creating my life out of the morass of my unhappiness became, in fact, a self-conscious project. And Fromm's psychology and worldview spoke directly to my project of self-creation. Without great elaboration, Erich Fromm presented a popularization of a very accessible version of the ethics of Aristotle and the theories of Karl Marx, the early theories of Marx, who spoke on alienation in modern society. For Fromm, the way to personal fulfillment is the creation of what he referred to, quote, as the productive character, the productive character. What that means is the person grows into himself or herself through the development and unfolding of one's latent potentialities. We all have distinctive human potentials, our potential to grow physically, emotionally, sexually, and with regard to other attributes that define us as human. To the extent that these potentials actualize and develop, we experience fulfillment. To the extent that they remain stunted, contentment and fulfillment elude us. In briefest terms, the very end of living is to love fully, that is, to flourish. The end of human life, its purpose, is nothing more than human flourish. But for Fromm, the activity of living is not done in isolation with others. Life is lived with and through other people because the human being is, by essence, a social being. We become ourselves, we flourish as individuals through the active engagement with other people. Well, for a depressed, lonely kid, this was music to my ears. It provided a path to salvation, so to speak, a personal salvation. A central aspect of creating the productive character, as Fromm put forward, is one's work. On a riff on Marx's thought, When we work, we are in fact interacting with and shaping the world outside ourselves. And when we do, we reciprocally or dialectically shape ourselves. In other words, the primary function of work is not to make money, but it is to build our characters. That idea enchanted me as a 16-year-old. It enchanted me and gripped my imagination at that early impressionable age. And it was essential in my coming to ethical culture leadership as the work to the work, I would spend my life doing. There were other streams that fed into an emergent humanist worldview as well. My religious education was in fact Orthodox, but Orthodoxy of Judaism was not practiced in the home. Moreover, I attended public schools and was socialized to a secular education. As a kid, I had an encyclopedic type of mindset, and I loved science, especially astronomy, and the cosmic wonder that it inspired. My secular education conflicted with my religious training, and so shortly afterwards, after my Orthodox bar mitzvah, I became an atheist. But as I made my way through adolescence, I appreciated more and more the essential importance of human relations. And so my atheism broadened and softened into humanism. And so it has been. Atheism is by definition a negative stance and says nothing at all by itself about human beings and human relations. Humanism is a positive worldview that affirms human beings, their values, and again, their flourishing. Moreover, humanism is not merely a philosophical and intellectual stance towards the world, but more fully needs to be lived and lived out. Humanism is, as we might say, humanism is as it does. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War was also in the forefront of our concerns, and I had aligned myself with the anti-war movement and the New Left. I was committed to a critique of capitalism, and as a late teenager, identified myself as democratic socialist, which which in effect aligned very well with my developing humanism, and I still so identify. These are the influences I inherited and the circumstances that molded me and the drives that led me on a search to get beyond an adolescence afflicted by psychic demons. And so when I was 20, I came upon ethical culture, which I discovered was as close to fulfilling my developing emergent humanistic worldview as anything imaginable. I was very attracted to it because here was actually an institution, an organization that stood for the very values that were personally, deeply, very important to me as my life was unfolding and I was trying to get beyond the problems occasioned by my mother's death and my father's decline. I was very attracted to ethical culture. It was a fulfillment of that philosophy that was personally very important. And so I joined the New York Society in 1968, the year I graduated from college. And to be frank, attending platforms in that cavernous hall among people who were 3 and 4 times my age felt awkward, at least, and was a challenge to be overcome. Okay, but given my intellectual disposition, I should say the humanistic philosophy of ethical culture at that time was really more important to me than the community, and so I stuck it out. As a 20-year-old, I also stuck out like a sore thumb, and one of the leaders of the society, and back then the New York Society had 5.5 leaders, approached me and asked if I was interested in becoming a professional leader in the ethical culture movement. Now, that was a career direction I don't think I would have come to on my own, but I was teaching then in the New York public schools and came rather soon to realize that I didn't want to make a career of it. So at 21, I was accepted into the leadership training program at the New York Society, and I conclude I was probably the youngest trainee in the history of ethical culture. I was just 21. If truth be told, the training program back then was not very well thought out, nor was it well organized or structured. In fact, for a shy kid, it was more than intimidating. The New York Society back then was simply patriarchy on steroids, okay? The reigning figure, the reigning icon at the New York Society was Algernon Black, and I knew Al quite well, at least in one sense. Al was a grandiloquent orator, a tireless left-wing activist, a great storyteller, and he was considered most of all to combating racial injustice and doing a lot of grassroots work, community work in Harlem. At one time, Al was both the vice president of the National ACLU and the vice president of excuse me, WA, the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. Al, in many ways, was a very great man, but warm and fuzzy, he simply was not. When talking with me, I never felt that he was actually talking with me, conversing with me. Rather, in conversation, he spoke at you and relentlessly speechified. I won't mention the other luminaries of that era, except for one who was very different by temperament and had the greatest influence in shaping my life. That was Dr. Horace Freese, probably not a name known to you. Horace was the half a leader, the part-time leader of the New York Society. Horace, in fact, was a distinguished professor of philosophy at Columbia University, one of the few who was named a distinguished professor. He was tall, gangly, and Lincoln-esque in appearance, and always spoke slowly with great deliberation, erudition, and care. Horace evoked great respect from us trainees, and we always referred to him as Dr. Freese, never by his first name. Horace, in fact, had founded the religion department at Columbia out of the philosophy department in the late 40s and early 50s. He was also the son-in-law of Ethical Culture's founder, Felix Adler, and he had married Adler's youngest child and daughter, Ruth Adler. We trainees would, on occasion, have seminars that Horace presented at their apartment in Riverside Drive, in which he and Ruth would talk about Dr. Adler, his philosophy, and his personal life. And so having known Ruth Freese puts me within just 2 degrees of separation from our founder, which a diminishing few, I think, in our movement can actually claim. But unlike his colleagues at the New York Society, Horace was a gentle and kind man. And I feel elevated that he saw something in me that he liked and believed showed promise. It was Horace who encouraged me to pursue a doctorate in religion at Columbia. And so I did. And I remain very grateful for Dr. Freese's encouragement. Perhaps he felt that I was especially qualified to carry forward the vision of his father-in-law, whom he esteemed, or at least I'd like to believe that. After my work in New York, I was assigned to continue my internship here at the Bergen Society for 2 years, from 1970 to 1972. It was then that I had met members of the Society, a good number who have remained dedicated to this community for all these many decades. I worked with the then leader, Paul Weston, who had served as the leader of the Baltimore Society and came to Bergen the year before. I got to know the members, worked with committees, officiated at weddings, helped found a free school in Bergen County and that was incorporated into the Teaneck public school system, and involved myself in diverse things that leaders do. I also worked with a small ethical fellowship centered around Wayne, which is no longer extant. Okay. After these 2 years, I became the leader of the Essex County Society in Maplewood, New Jersey. The Essex Society, in fact, is the oldest ethical society in New Jersey, founded as the Ethical Culture Society of Newark in 1945, but it's long been smaller than we are. Its meeting house is a large, elegant building that always seems to be in need of repair. That was a former infirmary on Prospect Street in Maplewood. It's quite a large building and had a few spare rooms, and I resided in the meeting house for the 2 years that I worked with the Essex Society. The membership of the Essex Society had a different character than our group here in Bergen back then. I think it was less formal, its members perhaps somewhat earthier, and the community had clearly a left-wing gritty sensibility. Organization, however, was not its strong suit, but a certain warmth was certainly present, and I enjoyed my 2 years working at the Essex Society. But by far the greatest consequence of my being with the Essex Society was that it was there that I met Linda in 1972. Linda was an independent member of the Essex Society who joined somewhat before I arrived. She had just gone through a very difficult divorce out of a very unhappy marriage. She had not yet completed her undergraduate degree, was bereft of alimony and child support, and she was rather unusual for a woman of that background and that ethos, in that she came loaded with 6 children, ages 3 to 11. Most 24-year-old men, I'm talking about myself, I suspect would flee from a woman with 6 kids as they would from a plague. Given that I was ready to move on to a new stage in life, I thought, and being a humanist, I saw Linda and her many kids, in fact, as an opportunity. She, in fact, was more beautiful in my eyes because she came with 6 beautiful children. Attaching myself to a large family and assuming a paternal role offered, I thought, a promising way by which to express and live out my humanist values in a very intimate way. Linda and I moved closer together, and in 1974, I moved into her home with her and her kids in Elizabeth. It was the beginning of a 41-year partnership with powerful mutual engagement, love, and mutual caring. The fact that the biological father was out of the picture made my parenting, in fact, less complex, and I remained endlessly proud and pleased that my 6 children have gone on to live extremely productive and successful lives. They all went through our Sunday school, I should say, by the way. 1974 was also the year I began my leadership here at the Bergen Society. For the first 2 years, I commuted from Elizabeth to Teaneck, often twice a day, once in the afternoon to receive the kids when they came home from school. Linda was doing social work internship at that point, and I prepared dinner for them, which they had trouble eating, and I'll talk about that some other time, only to return to the society for an evening meeting, of which there were very many. In 1976, we bought a beautiful home on Clinton Place in Hackensack, and I should say parenthetically that we wanted our children to attend an integrated schools, and the homes in Teaneck were just too small or were too costly. And on July 1st, 1978, Linda and I got married, and we held our wedding in our backyard, to which we invited all the members of the Bergen Society. 250 people attended our wedding in what was an all-day open house, and it was certainly a very beautiful day, as I recall. Well, this is the background, which brings me to the point at which I want to share with you the values I have brought to my leadership here at the Bergen Society, and why, as I'm about to leave, I can state with all sincerity, all honesty, that my life work has been extraordinarily fulfilling, perhaps as fulfilling as my vocational experience possibly could be. Once again, my humanism provides the guiding template against which I've experienced and measured that fulfillment. A salient aspect of my work has been the extraordinary freedom ethical culture leadership has afforded me to pursue my interests. In a position of leadership and as leader of an ethical society, I've been able to envision my own projects and goals according to my interests and talents, and then work to realize those goals and do so in a way that fulfills my philosophical values. That freedom is, of course, not absolute, nor should it be. It is constrained, indeed happily constrained, I would say, by my obligation to the community that I serve. My interests, goals, and projects need to be congruent with the interests, values, and needs of you, the members. If my values and the directions they take are not enmeshed in your values, I'm singing my own tune, which no one else hears, and my leadership is a failure. If in what I do, my values do reflect yours, and if I've been able to expand and enhance your lives by so doing, then my work becomes blissfully meaningful and satisfying. I've said to myself that an ethical leader and his or her vision and deeds should be one step ahead of the membership, but not 2 steps ahead. For if the latter, then there can be no successful communication, I think, change, or growth. A second way in which I've been fortunate in my work is that I've been able to live out my highest ideals and do so with my personal integrity intact. I suspect that many people cannot say that. I've spoken with many people who have shared with me with a great deal of angst that they have had to painfully suppress or violate their ethical values in order to survive in the workplace. They've had to lie for their bosses or deceive their clients and customers in order to ensure profitability. They live out the pain of what Dr. Adler called a divided conscience, a divided conscience. They exercise certain ethical values in their private lives, among their family and friends, but are coerced to act differently when on the job. My vocation has required just the opposite. As I understand it, ethical leadership goes even beyond bringing my ethical ideals to work. It requires, as I understand it, that I in fact be a living exemplar of the highest ethical ideals, both in my professional and personal lives, and there should be no gap between the two. In short, I need to practice what I preach. One may conclude this is a burden that comes with a very high bar, and I would claim that I've not always met it. We are all fallible. We are all have our vulnerabilities, and that's what makes, I believe, forgiveness necessary, or else human relations become just too brittle. But I conclude, more to the truth, that to strive to live with integrity in the recesses of one's private life and in one's professional and public life as well, and to do so without contradiction, is profoundly, and I would say, spiritually liberating. And I am very thankful for that opportunity. When I speak about being able to live out my ideals, and what has been exquisitely fulfilling is that ethical culture, essential to it, is the pursuit of justice, and it is to me as well. My mother was an exceedingly ethical person who taught me the importance of doing the right thing. She also taught me that conformity is not a virtue when others are doing wrong. And she probably was not the only mother to say, hey, Joseph, she's the only person I know who called me Joseph. Hey, Joseph, if everyone jumps off the Empire State Building, you shouldn't either. I mean, that was not quite original, but it was a message that, in effect, stuck, okay? When she died, I believe that I, in fact, internalized, okay, her ethics. I also construe, to be frank, try to be fair to the facts, and I say so humbly, I also construe myself to be a deeply empathetic person, and I try to be a caring one as well. I recoil, frankly, viscerally recoil at the pain of others. As a child, like many of my young peers, I liked watching Westerns on television. And while we were supposed to rejoice when the bad guys got shot and fall down dead, as a kid, my reaction was that to be shot must be exquisitely painful. And my compassion went out to the person who was so injured. Whether he was morally upstanding or morally reprobate was irrelevant to the pain he must be suffering as a human being. It is that identification with pain and suffering, as well as tragedy and oppression, that I believe lies at the bottom of my commitment to alleviate it and work for a world in which it is diminished, if not overcome, altogether. Beyond a philosophy, intellectualizing about justice, at its foundation, I believe, is something very simple, and that is an intuitive connection with those who are victimized by pain and oppression. The struggle for social justice is essential to ethical culture, and that has always been very important to me. Ethical culture is not foremost a social justice organization, however. We are a religio-philosophical organization for which the working for justice is derivative but essential to us. Without social justice, ethical culture would not be ethical culture. And I have tried through the years to work both through and with the society to ensure that we commit ourselves as a community to bring greater justice to the wider world. And I have tried to represent ethical culture beyond the work of the community itself. I tried to do this through concrete projects too numerous to mention in the fields of civil liberties and human rights, for the abolition of the death penalty, which I've always assessed as a moral abomination, on behalf of refugees, whom I construe as among the world's most beleaguered people. I worked across racial lines to try to stitch Teaneck together after the murder of Philip Pennell in 1990. I've participated in countless panels, conferences, and protests, and spoken at numerous rallies. Over the years, I've published scores of articles in newspapers and magazines related to social justice issues. On 2 occasions, I lent myself to arrest to expand, in one case, to expand the turf of civil liberties in New Jersey, and in the second, to protest apartheid in South Africa. I have worked on behalf of the homeless and helped to create a peace studies course, as we did in the society, that was actually picked up by Bergen Community College and factored into its curriculum. I spearheaded the creation of the Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Committee for Political Asylum Seekers, which in fact is growing very nicely. It's an independent nonprofit organization working to provide humanitarian services, including housing, to people most morally worthy who couldn't in fact be more different from us, who have suffered from persecution and have survived, in most cases, torture too horrific or difficult and painful to imagine. I think the initiative I am most proud of in the social justice realm within the society, however, was in the 1980s. It was our 2-year effort that brought the society, after, I would say, several dozen meetings in the society and in people's backyards around barbecues, that brought the society to declare itself a sanctuary for refugees fleeing the extraordinary violence in El Salvador. It took many educational meetings, again, to do this, including a debate between the head of the Immigration Service in New Jersey and an international lawyer Okay, it took lots of meetings, in effect, to bring us to the point where this middle-class suburban society actually committed an act of civil disobedience. We broke the law for the sake of a higher moral cause. And that was not easy to do. It took years of introspection and education about the issue, the political consequences, the politics of our government and politics in El Salvador and so forth. But we actually committed an act of civil disobedience. We were part of a national movement that was centered mostly in the Southwest, but we were one of only 2 religious groups in the state of New Jersey to do that. And I'm very proud of it. There are few greater pleasures, I think, broadly speaking, than to work together with others for a common cause, a cause inspired by one's highest ideals. And I've been able to do that. I want to touch on a few other things that have guided my leadership before I bring this talk and my career to a close. Every ethical leader finds areas in his or her leadership which he or she feels is most important. And I want to share with you 2 to which I've devoted much of my attention and care. Felix Adler had said that the platform address is the altar on which the fire burns. I have always taken our Sunday morning addresses most seriously, and I've given them a great deal of attention. The Sunday address has always been and remains, I believe, the central experience of the ethical society. It is the opportunity to directly communicate and reinforce our ideals, and it also serves as the primary experience that binds us together as a community when we come together on Sunday mornings. I bring certain values to the crafting of my addresses. In the first instance, of the more than 500 addresses I have rendered, I have never given the same address twice in the same society. Could have fooled you going back. I could have pulled one out of the draw. It's 30 years old. Nobody would know. But you got to believe me, friends, my conscience would not allow me to do it. And I haven't. I've tried to bring, in other words, something fresh and very fresh to the platform. And very often, I should say, in order to do that, I have fashioned my addresses out of a philosophical or intellectual problem that I'm personally struggling with, which ensures, I think, a certain immediacy, if not novelty. So that while it may appear that my addresses are intellectual and philosophical explorations, I should say that they are really at a much deeper level and, in a certain sense, autobiographical as well. In my interpretation, ethical culture, while the address, in my interpretation of ethical culture, while the address should be inspiring and could be moving, I don't believe that the address should be or can be about instilling a momentary high or a sense of exhilaration or ecstasy. Religious experiences, in fact, seldom take place in church. Rather, inspiration should result from sober reflection, I think, on what's presented, from the use to which ideas presented can influence the lives of the auditors, the people here, our members, for the better. Among the highest compliments I receive is when people tell me that because of the platform, they've come to think about things important to them in new ways, or when they tell me that they have discussed issues I've raised with their children over the dinner table. I construe that to be a very high compliment. While I believe that there is a spiritual sensibility that can be associated with humanism, I must say that I personally have shied away from what I would refer to as an ersatz spirituality, which has become fashionable in some circles. I do believe that the distinctive, distinguishing characteristic of ethical culture is our commitment to social ethics, a central commitment to social ethics. And though we have no creed in ethical culture, given that we have no scripture either, no Bible around which to center ourselves in ethical culture, I've always believed that we need to center ourselves around ideas as the binding sort of substitute for what a Bible, a scripture would do in a conventional religious faith. While platform addresses are not academic presentations, to be sure, I do believe, and this is me personally, I do believe that our addresses and our discourse should be high-minded. I don't believe in talking down to people or evaluating their intelligence. There's no dignity in that. For me, the unpardonable sin, I should say, as I compose my addresses, the unpardonable sin is to be platitudinous, simplistic, or simply dopey. Okay, I don't want to do that. If it were, I think, and if that were the case, I think ultimately over time we would erode as a community. I think there has to be a certain quality and high-mindedness in what we present. I try to bring a certain unity and coherence to the addresses and between them or among them. Once I introduce an idea, I try not to leave it dangling, but to bring it full circle, so to speak. The majority of my talks, but not all, have had at their center, if one were to analyze them and pull them apart, what I believe is the foundational ideal of ethical culture. And that is an abiding respect for the infinite dignity and worth of the person. And most of my addresses, the great majority, have been devoted to exploring and elaborating how we can apply the applications of that principle and ideal, how we can apply respect for human dignity in our private and public lives. This is the central value, again, from which our humanism flows. Another area, the second area I've given much attention to, is the creation of eulogies. Eulogies that I render at funerals and memorial services. I do believe, in accordance with my humanism, that each human life is infinitely precious. When someone dies, we find ourselves standing before the infinite, the eternal, and the absolute, which needs to evoke a realization of our own finitude and humility. I'm not a romantic about death. It brings feelings of great loss, sadness, and grief, and death is unwanted. It is never easy, and it shouldn't be. The death of another person whom we have known and loved should be treated, I think, with the greatest reverence. When I write a eulogy, I am humbly aware that, in a sense, I am rendering, in fact, the last word about that person. And so I try hard to get it right, realizing that the person whose life I'm summarizing is in no position to rise up, wag a finger at me, and tell me that I've gotten it wrong. I try to put myself in touch with the values the person's expressed, the values the person expressed and lived by, and what her or his interests and contributions were to the lives of others that made her or him unique and uplifted the lives of others. Words, of course, can never do enough to encompass a life, but I try to bring honor to the person, and perhaps thereby bring some consolation to those who are closest to that loved one and are in a state of bereavement. But beyond the addresses, the projects, the social justice work, the innumerable meetings to plan our work, the source of greatest fulfillment for me in my history with you has been sharing my work, which in great measure has been my life with you, the members of this wonderful community. In almost the past half century, I've entered into the lives of many hundreds of members in encounters assuredly too numerous to recount, clearly many, many thousands. Mine has not been a 9-to-5 job with clearly set boundaries. The gap between my life and work as an ethical leader has been very thin. Indeed, it often fades away altogether. We are a community devoted to stitching together human relations of many types on many levels, and I've been deeply immersed in our community and the lives of our members. I've been able, and you have permitted me, to enter into your lives, to touch and experience your humanity. I have shared with you your joys and your woes. We have engaged in endless conversations, both mundane and momentous. In many instances, I have tried to be supportive and sensitive, and many times you return my efforts with gratitude and respect. This engagement, this human engagement over these many years has been the source of my greatest fulfillment. I read the testimonials that appeared in our current newsletter, and I was tremendously moved that so many of you evoke those qualities of my character that I most value in myself. In short, I've been able to communicate myself to you through who I am and what I have been, and you have appreciated and affirmed me in ways in which I most want to be affirmed. This is by no means personally a small thing. Again, to be understood, I think, to be understood, truly understood by others is a gift that so meaningfully solidifies human connections and brings a type of sweetness and warmth to life. As a final thought, I want to focus on one more enduring source of satisfaction for me, which is also a word of encouragement for you as I depart. Felix Adler had once said that, quote, ethicizing is right organizing. What that suggests to me is that we cannot divorce the organization of our community, the mundane details of organization and administration, from the ethical values and ideals to which we are foremost dedicated. It may not be obvious to you because I haven't made it public, and I've tried not to make it obvious, that I've tried over these many years to consciously build the society according to a certain plan that I sustained. Let me put it this way. I'm a Democrat and an egalitarian. I, by temperament, simply do not like self-promotion, and I have never seen the Ethical Society as a fan club for its leader. The Bergen Ethical Society does not belong to me. It belongs to you, its members. And in accordance with that principle, through the years, I deliberately have attempted to shift the work away from those spheres of responsibility dealing with administration and organization and towards what I would call pure leadership activities. That is doing the speaking, the pastoral side of things, and representing our community in the wider world. It was a presumption that by retreating from those other tasks, I would in fact open up space that would be filled by you, the members of this community. And I believe, if I may say so, that that is exactly what has happened. Perhaps it was not wrong, it is not wrong to conclude that the leader of a community, especially over many years, does in fact materially play some role in molding the community and enabling it to become what it is and shaping its character. It's a dialectical process and relationship. And I am immensely pleased, as I'm ready to take leave, I'm immensely pleased that this is what has happened. I must admit that I am saddened, however, that we have not grown larger than we are. Our society is about the same size that it was when I entered a bit more than 46 years ago. We maybe should say that we should be pleased that we've remained incredibly stable. We have never, in effect, veered more than 20 members away from 180 members and so forth, but we haven't grown as well. And that's been a source of frustration. I would like us to be much larger. We've got a great idea and we should be bigger than we are. And of course, as you know, we have not achieved the racial diversity that we have hoped for. Although I should say we have become, if you look, we have become diverse in other ways, ethnically speaking, and in terms of religious backgrounds and memories and so forth. But I would say perhaps we have laid the groundwork for that to emerge in the future. I certainly hope so. But overall, what I wish to say is that I end my career with a sense of endless gratification and gratitude that you and I together have created a simply marvelous community of people who are amazingly devoted and dedicated to the Ethical Society and its ideals and to each other. We have a community of wonderful people, I feel, who are very kind, very smart, where egos indeed are kept to a minimum. That's very rare in volunteer organizations, and an organization, a community in which hearts are very large and very gracious. I will be leaving. The Ethical Society of the future will not be the same. Heraclitus tells us, quote, that all things change, and that it is a necessity and that's a necessity we all need to embrace. We need to be sufficiently flexible to accept the new. As for me, my retirement will require an adjustment. As noted, my work in great measure has been commensurate with my life. I have cared about this society. I've worried about it literally every day for more than 4 decades. My work has been a habit. It's a reflex, and it's impossible for me to imagine at this moment how I will wake up one morning and not care, though I suspect that quietly I still will. But whatever, my retirement will require some getting used to. As for all of you, the occasion of my absence will reflect a change perhaps in your lives as well. As difficult as my leaving is difficult for me to grasp, it is simply impossible, and this is my own limitation, it's impossible for me to take up your standpoint and imagine what it will mean for you. Perhaps it will be like a cousin who is always at family gatherings, and then you notice that he's just not there anymore. Perhaps my disappearance will mean more to some of you and maybe less to others. But whatever change my retirement may bring, I am totally confident that you and the society will simply be fine. There is just too much dedication and devotion, too much smarts, too much goodwill and good sense for it to be otherwise. Our society, friends, I am sure, will thrive. And turning back as a last word, turning back to myself and the meaning that my work has brought, I want to evoke a favorite adage from one of my favorite philosophers, William James, who in fact was very close to our ethical culture movement. William James had once said, and I think this is a very wise observation, that, quote, the greatest use of a life is to spend it on something that will outlast it, end quote. I am confident that the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County will outlast me. And yes, it has been a very great way to use my life. And so I want to extend to all of you my sincere thanks. Goodbye and stay safe. That's it, folks. The end.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. My sincere pleasure.
We thank you for your vision and your leadership. You will absolutely be missed. Your presence, however, as you've said, is throughout our society and throughout our organization and will be continued to be felt. We are going to have an opportunity to honor Joe at our December 27th platform. And so please get those anecdotes about Joe ready so that he can feel his presence, how the presence has impacted us as well.